But we've had a very busy day here at the American Hellenic Institute. Just 2 hours ago, as we sit here and as where I stand, we had the Minister of Defense of Greece here for a roundtable discussion with our board of directors. And so we quickly turned around this room, and now we have this noon forum here. So now I know what, baseball stadiums turn from one or well, in the old days, used to be baseball to football. Now it's like hockey to basketball and basketball to hockey, because baseball stadiums have their own stadiums and football stadiums have their own stadiums. But be it as it may, it is a pleasure to welcome you here today, to bid you a good afternoon, and to welcome you to this installment of our Noon Forum series. So on behalf of our Greek American nonprofit Public Policy Center, it is my official pleasure to present our Noon Forum in commemoration of the 96th anniversary of the Smyrna Catastrophe of 1922, titled The Smyrna Catastrophe of 1922, Memory and History. And as you know, here at the American Hellenic Institute, there are certain dates throughout the course of the year that we want to commemorate in the form of these Noon Forums, and the Smyrna Catastrophe is one that we always put on the calendar. Even though it's in September, we can't always do that because it's right after the beginning, the end of the holiday season, the summer season, so typically we end up doing it sometime in October. Sadly, the tragic events of August and September of 1922, where countless Greeks of Asia Minor were murdered, occurred during the era of the Armenian genocide and the broader genocidal campaign by the Ottomans against Greeks, Pontians, Assyrians, and other Christian communities. The once robust city of Smyrna, which at the time was a thriving center of Greek culture, was obliterated. The catastrophic events of 1922 are important to commemorate because they remind us of man's continuing inhumanity to man. Unfortunately, we continue to see egregious human rights tragedies and genocides occurring in the world even today, just as they did in Smyrna in 1922. Just take a moment to reflect upon the atrocities being committed against Christians in the Middle East, almost on a routine basis. Back in 1922, governments stood idle. They failed to act. In pausing for a moment to take time out of our busy schedules to remember Smyrna, we hope we are taking a step to halt this plague of human rights abuses and genocide that still exists in the 21st century. And we are pleased today to have with us a distinguished professor who will speak on the subject matter, Alexander Kitroeff, who will be introduced by Jim Marketos, one of our members of the board, who himself has done a good deal of research on this subject matter, and we've had him in the past talk on this commemoration. But before I call on Jim, let me just also recognize that we have with us here today. It's a great honor to have the ambassador of Greece to the United States, Mr. Haris Lalakos, here with us. And he's a very happy man today because his Boston Red Sox beat the New York Yankees and advanced to the American League Championship Series. So with that, Jim, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Nick. 96 years ago, a Greek military defeat in Turkey, followed by a seaside Holocaust in Smyrna, signaled the end of the centuries-old Greek presence in Asia Minor. AHI commemorates this disaster each year so that current generations will not forget this modern Greek tragedy, which was suffered by our ancestors and which is now a sad but undeniably important element of our Greek heritage. Today we are privileged and delighted to have with us one of the preeminent American historians of modern Greece. Alexander Kitroeff was born in Athens. He received his doctorate from Oxford University. He's currently Associate Professor of History at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. He researches and publishes on the history of identity in modern Greece and its diaspora in a broad range of fields, from politics to sports. His new book, The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt, From Muhammad Ali to Nasser, is being published by the American University of Cairo Press and will appear on November 5th of this year. Congratulations on that. He's also completing a book-length study of the history of the Greek Orthodox Church in America in the 20th century. He's collaborated as historical consultant with director Maria Iliu in 4 documentary films, including 2 on the Asia Minor catastrophe. One is called Smyrna 1922, The Destruction of a Cosmopolitan City. The other is From Both Sides of the Aegean, Expulsion and Exchange of Populations, Turkey, Greece, 1922-1924. It's our great pleasure to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Alexander Kitroeff.
Thank you so much for those kind words. Thank you for the introduction and being here. What I wanted to do today was speak as a historian about how we commemorate the Smyrna catastrophe. And my comments are motivated by my experiences. As was mentioned, I worked with Maria Iliu on the documentary Smyrna, the Destruction of a Cosmopolitan City, and on a subsequent documentary on the exchange of populations. The Smyrna documentary we took to, which isn't available for purchase on DVD yet, we took to 22 modern Greek studies centers across the United States, screened it and did a Q&A afterwards. This was funded by the Niarchos Foundation. And we've also shown the documentary in southern Los Angeles in Downey, which has got a very active Greek community. And also 10 days ago I was in Astoria, and we did a screening at the Federation of Hellenic Societies. And the first thing I have to say, the screenings were wonderful, and it was incredible to share the history and the story of Smyrna with the audience. But I must say the questions and answers we got, I felt were too broad, were all over the place. The documentary is about the destruction of Smyrna, not the Asia Minor catastrophe. But of course the Asia Minor catastrophe is such an important event in the history of modern Hellenism that somehow it was understandable that the questions and answers were going to go and touch on every conceivable aspect of those events. However, I feel that, and speaking now as this documentary was really addressed to a non-Greek audience, so we wanted, and it's in English, and we wanted the American public to learn about the Smyrna catastrophe, which is relatively unknown. The average American doesn't know about this event. The average American undergraduate doesn't know about this event and its implications. So what I'm going to talk about today is the difference between memory and history. They overlap, of course. Events happen in the past, historians study them, and the public remembers them both by reading what historians say and also through maybe their own family histories. There's a difference in the sense that historians can get into the details and the weeds, as we'd say, and maybe have some particular arguments. And with history, and that's the interesting thing about studying history, history renews itself. You always have new perspectives. New generations of historians look at a particular event in different, refreshing ways. So we always have a debate going. But it seems to me if we need to consider, given that this event is so little known in the United States, I believe as Greek Americans, we should prioritize certain aspects of the Asia Minor catastrophe and try and project them and convey them to the public. We are approaching the centenary. The events that started, and maybe the best way for me to begin is just to remind you very briefly of the major events that led up to the burning of Smyrna. And in fact, on 30th of October, we have the first of several centenary anniversaries. 30th of October is the anniversary of the Mudros armistice. That's the armistice between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies that brings the end of World War I in the Eastern Mediterranean. I know November 11th is known as Armistice Day in the West, but for us, Mudros is actually October 30th is more important. And after the Mudros armistice, we go on to the peace conference in Paris, which is takes place over several months. And sometime in early 1919, the great powers, and especially Britain with its Prime Minister Lloyd George, and this is one of the interesting things, gives Greece the right to go over the Aegean to the city of Smyrna and assigns military control to Greece of Smyrna and the surrounding areas. Some people say that it was the Allies wanted the Greeks to go there because they didn't want the Italians to take over Smyrna. I think a more likely historical interpretation is the abilities, if not the genius, of Eleftherios Venizelos, who made a very robust argument to the Allies at a time when President Woodrow Wilson was prioritizing the right of peoples for self-determination. And Venizelos made a credible argument that the ethnic Greek population of the shores of Asia Minor, centered around Smyrna, should be protected by the Greek army, and Greece was given the right to control the area until a referendum would take place. And the Greek army landed in Smyrna on May 15th of 1919. The city was taken over by the Greek army and the Greek administration. There was opposition by the local Turkish population, and soon enough Turkish nationalists started attacking the Greek lines on the perimeter of this area around Smyrna. The Greek army responded, and then we had a series of events that disrupted the Greek presence. First of all, we had the elections in Greece. They take place in November 1920. November 1920 are the shock results, the surprise results of the Greek elections, because Venizelos loses to the pro-monarchist side. And at the time, the pro-monarchist side was less enthusiastic about Greece's presence in Asia Minor because they believed they had a different attitude towards the extent to which Greece should commit itself to claiming land from the Ottoman Empire. But nonetheless, King Constantine, who became the head of state following the November 1920 elections, visited Smyrna in early 1921 and committed to continuing the presence of the Greeks in the area and continuing the campaign against the Turkish nationalist forces that were attacking the Greeks. By that time, by the summer of 1921, essentially we have what is known as a Greek-Turkish war. It was full-scale warfare. And at that time, the Greek forces decide to pursue the nationalists into the interior. There seemed to be no other way to defend the Greek positions but to pursue the nationalists up to their capital, Ankara, and eliminate that threat. And all this was being done at the time, originally with the support of the great powers, but at that moment, many of the great powers were, as some of you know, I think, were having a change of heart coming out of World War I, out of the warfare of World War I. They considered that they didn't want to be committed to the Eastern Mediterranean as fully as they had been, so they were getting cold feet about what they were going to do in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Greek forces were extended, and essentially exposed both by the fact that they had gone so far into the Asia Minor, Anatolian territory, and exposed diplomatically because the great powers were beginning not to back up the Greek positions. So there was they were exposed militarily and diplomatically. There was a standstill by 1921, late 1921, when operations began in the spring of 1922. The Turkish nationalist forces had become strengthened, the Greek forces had weakened, and it is, again, I think most of you remember or know this, August 1922 was when there was a huge battle it was almost on the outskirts of Ankara. One author, Lou Uranek, in one of the recent books that's been written, put it very well. He said that the Greeks had reached almost artillery range distance from Ankara. And yet there was that crucial battle was lost by the Greek forces. The front collapsed. The Greeks retreated to Smyrna. The Greek forces were evacuated. The refugees, a lot of the ethnic Greek populations followed the Greek forces back, crowded into Smyrna. The Turkish forces entered Smyrna. 4 days later, we have the burning of the city. The refugees amassed on the quayside, and the tragic events that we know about, the difficulties of evacuating the refugees, the Allied ships not wanting to take them on, and in the end certain initiatives were taken, including by Americans, and the refugees, women and children refugees, were evacuated. A lot of men were taken into labor battalions, which basically, if you were taken into a labor battalion by the Turkish forces at the time, that was basically a sentence of death. They were taken into the interior, either killed outright or would die eventually. It is a dramatic and complicated story, and precisely because it's a complicated and dramatic story, I think we need to prioritize what the most important things are about it and what things are maybe left to historians. And I don't mean leave the historians to figure it out. Obviously we want to know about them and know what the historians are writing, but in public events and as we approach the centenary, I think there are some huge issues that, you know, I felt when I went to the 22, 23 modern Greek studies programs, and I felt that there were very important events and people were overlooking them and discussing some of the details. So let me start. I've got 5 things that I think are more historical issues that are still being debated, and then I've got 5 issues that I think are really crystal clear and have to be projected. So what I want to share with you today is my views of those. So let me start with the 5 issues that are still complicated and still debated. The first one is the role of the Greek governor of Smyrna, Steriadis, who was appointed by Venizelos to run the city after the Greek forces landed. Steriadis was a very apparently moody and autocratic figure, and he caused a lot of bad feeling among the Greeks of Smyrna because he was so strict. In the documentary of Smyrna, one of the people who participated is Vanna Solomonidou, who works in our Greek press office in London and did a doctorate on Steriadis. Vanna Solomonidou is the granddaughter of Christos Solomonidis, the major journalist, Greek journalist in Smyrna. So she comes with a lot of personal investment and a lot of knowledge about this. And Vanna Solomonidou is her work counters the negative things about Steriadis, in the sense that she says that Steriadis was working to retain a cosmopolitan character in the city. Steriadis founded a university in which Muslims were allowed to study. He did health services which were open to the whole of the city. In many ways, this governor, who a lot of Asia Minor Greeks are ambivalent towards, was working to preserve the cosmopolitan character of the city. But Steriadis it's still complicated. Her work hasn't been published yet, so this is one of the things that is still being debated. And you know, people were putting their hands up after the documentary, and they said, but you treated Steriadis very well. You know, it's okay, you know, fine, we treated him well because we have an expert here who thinks this thing, etc. Let's just wait for the dust to settle over Steriadis. But for especially people in Greece, Steriadis is a buzzword that can create a great deal of reaction. And linked with this thing with Steriadis, we spoke about Smyrna as a cosmopolitan city, and we had some criticism over that. There was someone wrote in the Estia newspaper, which is a historic, conservative newspaper, that the historian and the director Maria Iliou made a mistake. Smyrna is not cosmopolitan; it was a Greek city. You know, okay. What is a Greek city? What is a cosmopolitan city? You know, I'm studying, you know, my father's family was from Chios and then went to Alexandria, done this thing. You know, was Alexandria a Greek city? Of course, in many ways, with Cavafy there, it was Greek, but it was also cosmopolitan. This idea that we shouldn't be claiming these cities as Greek, even if we've got the biggest ethnic group, because I think the advantage of the Greeks abroad and the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire is precisely that they were able to thrive and interact in cities with other ethnic groups. And we are somehow negating that when we call Smyrna a Greek city, even though the Greeks were the biggest ethnic group, and they were maybe even close to 50%, or they were 40%, and the figures are so difficult to decide. You know, what do you tell the Armenians and the Jews then in the city if you call it a Greek city? So again, I think to call Smyrna a cosmopolitan city, and it's a city in which the Greek letters and Greek business thrived so much, is actually a plus. But there's some negative feedback on that, and next point, there's been a lot of recent debate in Greece, and justifiably, it's interesting. It's an interesting debate about Venizelos' decision to send the Greek troops over. A very respected historian, Zvolopoulos, has published questioning whether it was the right thing to send the Greek troops over in 1919 to protect the Greek population. I personally think it was the right thing, because the Greek populations were being targeted for almost a decade by the Turkish nationalists. But it's a great debate. When we had the screening at the Federation of Hellenic Societies, a lot of the discussion was taken up by, was Venizelos right or wrong? Because there were people who were passionately this is Greek revisionist history, you know, that a figure such as a statesman such as Venizelos has to be, his actions have to be interrogated. Sure, they've got to be interrogated. No one is faultless. Even Venizelos makes mistakes. But to consume the discussion about commemorating Smyrna on whether Venizelos was right or wrong seemed to me to be kind of a little bit off the mark. By the same token, very recently, there's been debate about the Greek government preventing Asia Minor Greeks from returning to Greece as late as the summer of 1922. And again, there's a very respected historian, Vlasis Artzidis, in Greece, who is raising these issues, and they're valid issues, and it's a valid conversation as well. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of Greeks whose parents or grandparents were refugees feel that somehow Greece was not fully accommodating and not fully sympathetic to the plight of the Asia Minor Greeks. And that, again, is a justified thing, but it seems to me to be such a complicated issue that, and needs to be processed, why Greece didn't want to weaken the Greek presence demographically. I mean, obviously it didn't want to do it because we wanted to claim Smyrna at the moment. So if you had population leaving, and then of course the disaster happens. So it's one of these complicated things that historians have to figure out again. Two more issues of the complicated nature of the Smyrna catastrophe. The scorched earth policies of the Greek army. The Greek army, the front collapsed very badly, and there are books that talk about destruction of the villages that the Greek army did as it was retreating to protect itself. Scorched earth, destroying civilians who and villages especially, and resources that might help the pursuing Turkish army was part of that. That's how armies were fought at the time. But there's a context to the scorched earth. I must say, the scorched earth policies are not really recognized in Greek schools, and when we screened the film in Athens, we had the premiere at the Bernaki Museum, people got very irritated. It was actually, I think, Professor Veremis, a very respected professor, who spoke about the scorched earth, tried to explain it. The lights went on and someone came up to Veremis shouting, "Anakalesate, anakalesate." Look, it's complicated. This is warfare, I was talking earlier about 1821. When the Greeks took over Tripoli in 1821, there were some Muslims slaughtered. This was 1821. This is what happened in certain wars. Again, context. We need context. And the final complicated thing is the attitude of the great powers. There's a big debate, of course, in Greece, because the great powers, the foreign factor, has always influenced Greek history. And it's a very tricky one, because it's the great powers who support Greece's quest to go into Asia Minor. But on the other hand, the great powers have a change of heart, really a diplomatic change. There's a change of priorities. I think Greece is the victim of what we would call in history a broader philosophy. It wasn't that they were abandoning Greece, but they were abandoning their policy of commitment to the Eastern Mediterranean, and in doing so, of course, they exposed Greece, and they were not supporting Greece. So again, I'm not talking about the great powers not allowing their vessels to take on the refugees who were jumping in the sea to save themselves. I mean, I think that's a horrible instance. But I'm more talking about the diplomatic support that the great powers were offering. There's, sometimes I have to remind, not maybe you, but Greek audiences, the great powers, they're following their interests. Their interests coincided with ours. We were lucky, and then our interests didn't coincide, and therefore we were exposed. And it's a very difficult thing to understand. It's complicated, great power politics. Let me now just turn to the 5 things that I think we should be stressing when we commemorate Smyrna. The first thing I've already mentioned, the cosmopolitan character of the city. I think that's an extremely important thing. It strikes me as stunning that some Greek American audiences couldn't immediately see the connection between their experiences in the United States and the fact that the Greeks of Smyrna were thriving in a cosmopolitan city and that the Turks destroyed that cosmopolitan city. I mean, it's so obvious to me that the Greeks are an ethnic group that interacts and is able to thrive in cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic environments, and that Smyrna was cosmopolitan, and what was destroyed was obviously a Greek city in many ways, but also a cosmopolitan city. The second point is, you'll find it strange that I'm even mentioning it, but the destruction, the burning of the city of Smyrna, the Turkish troops took over the city of Smyrna and for 4 days controlled it with pillaging and massacres. But the turning point was when they decided to burn the city, more specifically to burn the Armenian and the Jewish quarters. That official Turkish historiography, and I'm talking about official Turkish historiography because there are many Turkish historians who acknowledge Turkey's responsibility, but official Turkish historiography blames the Armenians. And at first, when I was working on the Smyrna thing, I found it such a ludicrous proposition that I wasn't even mentioning it in classes. But it seems to me that this idea persists, and I think it should be made very clear. The evidence we have come from American missionaries. We're not citing Greeks here. We're talking about American missionaries who were working both with Muslims and with Christians. It's not as if they were biased in any way, and they just observed the Greek the Turkish irregular forces and the Turkish forces pouring petrol, etc. I mean, these things have been documented, and you know, it may seem obvious and seem ludicrous to dispute, but I think it should be stressed. Third point, I think the extent of the violence, and again, it connects, of course, with the second point. I know that Greece is going through a difficult diplomatic stage because of the situation in Turkey. You know, talking with fellow Turkish historians, we kind of understand that the Greeks and the Turks can understand each other better if we can actually just be open, honest, and clear about everything that happened in the past. Some Greek historians haven't done that, and there was a furor about several years ago when a Greek historian, writing about the refugees who were trapped, massed onto the quay with the city burning behind them and a cordon of Turkish troops around them, she used a very unfortunate term. The Greek word would be synostizondusan, which would be they were being crowded or something, you know, whatever one would do in a subway car. And there was a furor in Greece over this. And I don't think she's ever retracted that, which I think sometimes historians, we make mistakes. We use the wrong words. We make a wrong assessment. You know, I think it's an attempt to try and somehow avoid talking about ethnic cleansing and violence because of sensitivities. No, I think we've got to tell the story of the violence. It is a shocking account, the suffering of the Greeks at the hands of the Turkish forces and the Turkish irregulars in the city is shocking, and I think it's a responsibility of the historians to come up and explain and talk and illustrate that. First of all, we've got to respect the memory of the victims, let alone anything else. But second is, I think we're not disrespecting anyone when we talk about the ethnic violence committed. The final 2 points, the issue of the Armenians. Again, sometimes the Greeks talk about Smyrna and as if there were no. The Armenian element was smaller, but it was there, and the Armenians suffered next to the Greeks, the Armenians were also suffering. Their neighborhood was burned first, and I think we should recognize this. The film was screened in California at an Armenian bookstore, and I Skyped in before and afterwards, and it kind of made very clear to me, wow, these people suffered and experienced exactly the same things, and somehow we overlooked them. And then my final point is a very small one, but I think a very important one here in the United States when we commemorate Smyrna, and that is the status of the Jewish population in Smyrna. We've got some questions about, okay, Greeks, okay, Armenians, what happened to the Jews? The answer is the Jewish community in Smyrna was smaller, much smaller, because the Ottomans placed the Jews in certain cities, Thessaloniki, Andrianoupoli, but not so much in Smyrna. What happened in Smyrna was a very interesting thing. You had two groups of Jews. One was the Ashkenazi Jews who'd come from Eastern Europe, and the other one were the Sephardic Jews, the local Sephardic Jews, who were Ottoman subjects. The local Sephardic Jews, as Ottoman subjects, who were not involved with Zionism and didn't have any nationalist differences with the Turks, the Sephardic Jews believed they could sit out the problems and just stayed put. The fire didn't affect their neighborhood, and they stayed put, hoping that they could reach an accommodation with the Turkish nationalists, which of course in 1940 they suffered the discrimination of the taxes imposed on the foreigners. So, but what the Ashkenazi Jews did, soon as the nationalists were approaching Smyrna, they left the city very quickly, because the Ashkenazi Jews had the memories and the experiences of the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and soon as they saw what was happening in the city, they knew exactly what was going to happen, and they left. But it's an important, I think, aspect. It's an important part of our story. So, in conclusion, what I've tried to what I've tried to do is retell the Smyrna catastrophe through a non-Greek lens, a Greek-American lens, a vantage point that universalizes the Smyrna catastrophe. I think when we write Greek history, and I include us Greek Americans when we write Greek history, because Greek history is not well known, because Greece has suffered, because Greece is isolated, because many reasons, we somehow become very ethnocentric and dig our heels in and talk about the Greeks as having been victimized, or we're either fantastically great because our ancestors is Pericles, or we've been victimized during the Ottoman period, etc. And those things are true. But when we tell our story, the experiences of the Greeks, there's so many parallels with other people that I think the one way to project it and to memorialize it is to make those connections. And in a sense, I think we are validating what we're trying to do by universalizing the Greek story and the Asia Minor catastrophe. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. We have some Q&A, and let me begin, and let me go down a little slippery slope here.
Oh dear.
Regarding one of your earlier, points of controversy. We certainly know of the fire bombings of Dresden. The United States has dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and there were actually fire bombs on Tokyo that actually killed more than even the atomic bombs killed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I say that within the context of what you said, context of a certain time period. Just so there's no misunderstanding, especially as we have this presentation, videotaped here, and we will be distributing it. In the context of the scorched earth policy, there can't be no mistake about it in the sense of that time's warfare. There was a military confrontation between the Turkish army and the Greek army. The Greek army was retreating within a military campaign. The Turkish army was, pursuing it, and they needed to do within the context of that period to do what they could to ultimately escape.
Correct.
So we're in agreement in terms of
Yes.
that, in terms of the contents. There is absolutely no denying the fact, though, that once the Greek army had fled and the Turks arrived in Smyrna, that was calculated. That had nothing to do with modern day warfare at that time. That was a very calculated action on behalf of the Turkish nationalists, the Turkish army, the Turkish authorities at the time, in terms of what they perpetuated in the 4 days that followed regarding the civilian population, not the military of Greece, but the civilian population of Smyrna.
Yes, and I actually make it even stronger, because some people have suggested, oh, okay, so there was scorched earth policy, that's why Smyrna was burned. No, because when Smyrna is burnt, there is no Greek army left in Anatolia. They have been evacuated. You've got an open city, an undefended city with civilian populations. The war is essentially over. The war is over. Any context, any warfare, any of those factors that connect with warfare do not exist anymore. Even stronger than that, now that they've taken over the city, they have the responsibility for the welfare of the population of the city. You've called the city infidel Izmir because it's whatever it is. Okay, you've taken it over now. Okay, show us what you can do. And instead, we have the massacres and the burning. Yes.
Anybody from the audience, just identify yourself, please. Go ahead.
I'm Karen Batchel. We spoke earlier. I'm writing a book of fiction that includes the burning of Smyrna. And a comment and then a couple questions. When I do talks on a previous book about World War II in Greece, people would say, what's your next book about? And I say, I mentioned the population exchange. And there are blank faces. No one had. And then I say, you know about Armenia? Oh, yes. Everybody knows about that. So just, people don't. They have no idea of Smyrna or the population exchange. But a couple questions. Probably it's similar to like Yugoslavia, but why was there such animosity with the Turks who lived in Smyrna against the Greeks and the pillaging and the horrible things that happened? Is it just enough, like I said, like Yugoslavia where the Serbs went after the Muslims, or what, vice versa?
Yes.
Second question, just so we can finish both.
You mentioned the Ashkenazi Jews. Did they get out? You said
Yes.
they got out. Did they get out like really early, or were they part of the people that were stuck on the quay?
Most of them were leaving
Early.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. And they went over to the Greek islands across the Aegean, Rhodes and Kos especially. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
There was no animosity in Smyrna itself. That's the point, that the populations,
They got along well.
they got along well. The animosity comes from ideologically driven outsiders, if I can put it that way. And in fact, we have some information that Turkish inhabitants of Smyrna are mourning the loss of what they consider their city as well, to the fire and the violence. And this, helps me just underscore again the fact that the Greeks were getting on with the other populations, of the other ethnic groups of the city. Yes, the Muslim population was mostly manual laborers and working. There was also, though, a landowning elite, but relations in the city were very good. In fact, that's one of the extraordinary things, that things were very calm in the city right until the army arrived, even though they knew that there was fighting going on.
And then you can also put that to the same context of Cyprus, where the Greeks and the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots lived and joined villages and so forth prior to 1974. Any other questions? Over here, and then we'll go to Steve. Go ahead.
Kitroeff, can you elaborate on the role
Paris
of...
Michael.
I'm sorry, Paris Michael.
Are you still flying for American Airlines?
Yes, I am. Yes. Can you elaborate on the role of Kemal Ataturk at the time of 1922, 1921? I'm pegging you down.
Yes, nice. It's we at some point in the documentary we have a kind of headshot of Mustafa Kemal, and there were kind of gasps in the audience in Athens, you know. There's two things. He obviously, from the Turkish point of view, he's the founder of modern Turkey and the leader of the nationalist movement. And seen from that perspective, he's an important figure that one could respect the role of. However, his stance in Smyrna was, I'd say, criminal, because he arrived in the city and stayed in the city, but chose to locate himself just outside in the neighborhood of, it's called Burnabat in English, or Burnovas in Greek, across the water, and stayed there and did nothing when the fire broke out. He also is responsible for appointing a fanatical Turkish governor of the city, who is the main person responsible for the brutal killing of the Greek archbishop. So Mustafa Kemal, obviously the founder of modern Turkey and all that implies, but his role in the destruction of Smyrna is really quite shocking, because he is in command. He could have, with one word, he could have stopped the fire and the massacres, but he didn't. He sat across the water and watched.
So in your opinion, his reputation as the truth of his reputation is being suppressed.
Yes.
By modern history.
Oh, yes.
Politically correct purposes and so forth.
Yes, there's a big story to be told with politically correct purposes. I don't know if we have time.
Not the best of a historian, but since you're wrestling with the idea of how to publicize and get this message out to a broader audience, if you had to be in an elevator and do your elevator speech to an American who knows very little about these events, what is important about Smyrna in the context of, let's say, the 20th century history? Why do we need to know about Smyrna?
Because I think what I would say is important about Smyrna is that what is destroyed is a society which is multi-ethnic and multicultural. And that pattern is repeated not only in Constantinople, but also in Yugoslavia mentioned and other places. So I would project to someone in this elevator that what is lost is it's the interaction between human beings, irrespective of ethnic group and religion. And if we validate that and if we approve of that, then what's left.
Well, on that sobering note, but it never ceases to amaze me. When you go back with the Armenians, and Hitler's been quoted as saying, "Who remembers the Armenians?" and proclaiming his final solution, regarding the Jewish slaughter. And then after that, you have other slaughters that continue on history. And as long as great powers and those who can influence don't step in and try to prevent this, unfortunately, we'll continue to see this. And that's why it's continuously important to have these commemorations, to remember these atrocities throughout history that they took place, and not that far ago, not that long ago. It's within the current blip of history, frankly, and it's a sad stain regarding our society and certainly the West. And we need to continue to make sure we commemorate them, so that somehow, in this small way, they will not repeat themselves in the future. So we thank Professor Kitroeff for being here today, and taking the time to come down from Haverford on the Amtrak and for this presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, since we have food for 36 people, there's a lot of food back there.
Thank you very much.